And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show, where we cut through the noise and talk facts, fundamentals, and real forces shaping Americans' energy future. I'm your host, Kym Bolado, and today we're doing our annual energy wrap-up, a look back at the past year of supply shocks, policy shifts, market volatility, and technology disruption. And joining me is someone who is consistently delivering clarity in the world full of confusion, Robert Rapier, the editor-in-chief of SHALE Magazine. He's also an engineer, analyst, and one of the most respected voices in the energy literacy. When Robert talks about markets, scaling problems, or transition realities, people listen. Today, we're unpacking the biggest question America asks about energy this year, which are the trends that spike in let me start over that. Today, we're unpacking the biggest questions America asked about energy this year, the trends that spiked in search traffic, dominant conversations, and ultimately shaped the industry. Robert, welcome back to the Energy Mixx Radio Show.
Thanks for having me on, Kym.
So let's begin with the big question that everybody wants to know before we start doing really deep dives into where we're going. Where the heck do we stand with energy? Because it seems like we've gone up and down and on a roller coaster and all around. But yet, with this administration, they have said we're okay. And with Secretary of Energy Burgum at the helm and Secretary of Energy Chris Wright at the helm, both seasoned and experts in this, I kind of believe that maybe we really do have a handle on what's happening, even though it seems like we're going in a roller coaster ride all over the place.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure how the year was going to go at the beginning of the year because it was clear that toward the end of 2024, things were starting to slow down. So I predicted the last 2 years that we'd set an oil production record. I did not predict that this year because I just wasn't sure. As we're in December now, I've looked at the numbers. It is clear, and it's been clear to me since July or August that we would set an oil production record. And it's looking like we're almost certain to set a natural gas production record as well. So that'll be the third consecutive oil production record. That is the most oil produced by any country in a year ever in the history of the world. Same natural gas. I don't remember how many years in a row for natural gas, but it's more than the three that it will be for oil. But at the same time, particularly with oil, things are starting to slow down. We're not growing as quickly as we did for the past couple of years. So we're going to set a record, but I'm less confident that we will set another record in 2026. Now, a year ago, I was saying the same thing. I was saying, well, we're going to set a record in 2024. I'm less confident we will do it in 2025. And yet here we are. We're at another record. So, but working against us going into 2026 is oil price. Oil prices are a bit depressed, and that is going to slow down activity. It's already slowing down activity, and we are likely to see that play out in flattening oil production going into 2026.
And this administration, because you said we've hit record highs for 3 years, and two of those, President Trump was not in office. And we kind of understand why we were hitting those records due to the policies of the Biden administration. President Trump, he's done a lot of deregulation and has actually flip-flopped, if you will, what the Biden administration was trying to do with energy. Has any of this also been related to why we've seen a record high this year as well, hit new records? Is it because of his policies as well?
Not really. I mean, maybe a little, but the single biggest thing always
Demand?
is oil prices. I mean, yeah, and that relates back to demand. The single biggest thing, it doesn't matter who's president. I mean, look at Obama. I mean, we had the largest expansion of oil and gas production in U.S. history under Obama. Now, was that because of his policies? No, it was because that is when producers figured out how to frack, and the shale boom happened. Prices were high. They had been, they'd gone over $100 a barrel in 2000. In about 2005, they were up nearly $150 a barrel by 2008. that spurred a lot of production. So Obama came in, he had different policies. He wanted to pursue renewables, but oil and gas production just kept taking off. And so when Biden came in, same thing. Biden wants to pursue a green agenda. But when Russia invaded Ukraine and we embargoed Russian oil, that helped drive the price of oil to very high levels. And in turn, that's what producers respond to. They look at high oil prices and they say, produce as much as we can to take advantage of these high oil prices. And when Trump came on, oil prices were still relatively high. And he's trying to manage this situation where he gets low gas prices for consumers while keeping, oil production high. But those two goals pull against each other. If gas prices are low, and gas prices are low because oil prices are low, eventually that hits the producers, and the producers are going to slow down, and you will see that. And we're seeing it right now. We're seeing a slowdown in the growth. So if you look at the growth for the past 3 years, it's slowed down every year, and it'll be slowed down again this year. And it could actually go negative next year. We could see a pullback next year. It's too early to tell, but I see the price where it is, and I see oil producers not particularly enthusiastic about going out there and producing as much as they can.
And just for history's sake, if we remember Obama, when he was in office, we had the export ban on exporting crude that he lifted in his administration to get Obamacare through. I think that was also a deal changer that really changed the trajectory of the whole shale play, because by that time we had figured out how to frack that rock, like you said. But it wasn't that he was pro energy. It just so happened he needed to get Obamacare through, and he lifted that ban, which really changed the dynamics of what was happening here in the United States on a global scale pertaining to
Well, yeah,
energy.
U.S. producers were running out of places to. I mean, the crude, the lighter crude, is not a good match for the U.S. refineries, which have tooled to process heavy sour crudes over the years. And the shale oil is lighter and sweeter. And while the refineries can run it, their economics are not as good, so they don't want to pay as much money for it. And with the crude export ban in place, we were really having a glut of production. And with that crude export ban being lifted, suddenly, we're starting to export a lot of oil, and that oil can go into places, where they need that oil. They got, refineries that are better suited for it. And at the same time, we can import oil that's, better economics. I used to work in a refinery in Billings, Montana, and I worked in the economics, the refining, the economics group and optimization group for the refinery. And I would look at the crudes and the economics, and we could get shale oil, but there was a premium. Or we could get heavy, nasty, sour Canadian crude for $30 or $40 cheaper. We made significantly more money on that crude. And so that's what we preferred to run through the refinery. Our margins were much better on that heavy, sour crude. And so, when people sometimes they don't understand, why we're exporting oil when we could supply all our refineries with the crude production from the shale plays. It's just not as economical for the refiners to run that crude.
Well, when you look at the global scarcity capacity, especially when we have to think about OPEC plus versus US shale, how has it balanced the power change this past year too? Who really sits on marginal prices in 2025? In years past, and I'm very grateful to have so many mentors, the railroad commissioners helping me to understand and sift through data and understand this. I've always been told in the past that normally it was OPEC that set price. And now there's just been such a change. So tell me the differences. Who is really setting marginal prices in 2025, in your opinion? Is it
So
still OPEC?
we've got to go back 15 years. 15 years ago, OPEC was still setting prices, but the shale boom was really getting underway. And the U.S. every year was adding 1 million barrels a day of new production. And it became clear pretty quick that OPEC was losing its pricing power, and U.S. shale was taking market share away from OPEC. And in late I think it was 2014, OPEC finally said, okay, enough is enough. We've got to put these guys out of business. And they went out and they flooded the market with oil. And that's when oil prices dropped all the way down into the 20s. For the first time since the shale boom got underway, you saw oil production pull back in the U.S. You saw a retreat because the oil price collapsed in 2015. But what happened was they put some of the marginal producers out of business, but most of the guys tightened their belts and they made it through this OPEC price war. And I called this OPEC's $1 trillion miscalculation. I was actually on CNBC to talk about this during that time, about what OPEC was trying to do. And I said they will lose. They are going to lose $1 trillion with this strategy. And a couple of years later, they waved the white flag and they said, okay, enough. We're going to go back to trying to set price by restricting production. Now, they still have some control over price. They have more control over price as an entity than anyone else. Because when you think about it, I don't know, OPEC still produces 40% of the world's oil. No individual producer in the U.S. comes anywhere close to a fraction of that. And so, nobody in the U.S., and they can't collude in the U.S. They can't all get together and say, hey, ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron, let's all cut production. That's illegal. But OPEC can do it. So OPEC collectively still has a lot of sway over oil prices, but they've lost a lot of that pricing power. They don't have as much because of the abundance now of U.S. shale out there. So OPEC has lost significant pricing power in the last 15 years.
Very good. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk to you about something you write about often, which is scaling realities. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We'll be right back. Okay.
What was the question? What realities?
Scaling.
Oh, scaling. Okay.
Scaling. Okay. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. This is our year-end show in which we're looking back at everything that happened in the energy sector. And my guest today, Robert Rapier, editor-in-chief of SHALE Magazine, is putting everything in position for us to understand what happened as we look back for 2025. Robert, you often write about scaling realities. What energy transition technologies today are fundamentally limited by scaling physics and or material intensity. Which ones can truly scale now with everything kind of changing the dynamics?
Okay, you're gonna give me an opportunity to use one of my favorite analogies. I came up with this several years ago. We just passed Thanksgiving, and it's related to Thanksgiving. So I wrote a book in 2012, and one of those, and I discussed this in the book. I used to work for a wealthy energy entrepreneur in Hawaii, and he would send me all over the world looking at projects. And you look at a project and you say, how will this scale? And this analogy occurred to me at one point because I could see this happening as plants would try to go from a lab into a larger reactor. So imagine, and I love analogies, and I think this one will resonate with people. I've had people tell me that helped me understand scaling. Imagine you are cooking a turkey for Thanksgiving. So you've got a turkey in the oven and you're trying to get it just right. So that's your lab reactor. Now, imagine that you're trying to scale this up now. And what you need to do now is cook 100 turkeys an hour. So now think about the problems you've got. How are you going to cook 100 turkeys an hour? You have a much bigger oven. Okay. But then we've got, heating differences in there. We got some turkeys may burn by the edges and are closer to the heating elements. How are we going to make this a continuous process? Do we have a conveyor belt of turkeys, going through? So those are just some of the scaling problems. Cooking one turkey is one thing. It's like doing an experiment in the lab in a batch reactor. You got a beaker and you've got, things happening. And now you're trying to scale this. So scaling means you're trying to do this now continuously at larger scale. So one turkey to 100 turkeys an hour. And anybody that's ever cooked a turkey knows That's a big problem. If you had to cook three turkeys instead of one, that's a big problem. You want them all done at once. You don't want you don't want to have to cook them one after another. You've got to have everything done at once. So that starts to let you think about some of the really the heat implications. You got to have even heating across reactions. You got to have even mixing. That's not an issue with turkeys, but you got to have even mixing in the reactions, and that becomes more difficult as the reactors get larger and larger and larger. And so then you got, okay, what type of reactor? You've got a beaker. Well, does that translate into a big kind of a drum reactor, or you got a kind of a tubular reactor then that you've got constant flow through, that you've got reaction. And these are all core chemical engineering principles. These are the kind of things that we work on for chemical engineering. And that's the scaling problem. And a lot of people do not understand the scaling problem. And scaling knocks out most developing technologies. Trying to scale, you do something in the lab, and I've done it before myself. Scaling has knocked me. I knocked one of my experiments out at Texas A&M whenever I was working in graduate school. I had a scaling problem, and I couldn't get an experiment that had worked to scale up. And this is the biggest issue of some of these emerging technologies. And so that's very much in layman's terms. I think anybody will understand why something can be promising, and people put out a press release about this technology, but you really start to run into some hurdles as you scale it up. And the more things you have to solve, say you've got a heat issue, but you also got a mixing issue, and you've also got to do this continuously. The more hurdles you have to solve, the lower the probability is that you're going to scale all those hurdles. So that's why most of these technologies, these promising technologies, get knocked out at a very early stage.
Which ones is there any specific energy transition technology that you're seeing that might actually be able, which ones do you see truly being able to scale, look promising to you? Are there any?
Well, so some of them scale in a different way, like solar panels. You scale that just by putting out more solar panels. But some like biofuel technologies, that becomes really challenging because you're scaling up, from a few liters a day to barrels a day to, thousands of barrels a day. That's where things become very, very challenging. Wind turbines, they scale by getting larger and larger, but as they get larger and larger, you start to have some issues there. You start to make more noise and more vibration, and so as a wind turbine gets bigger, the economics get better for it, but you have some issues. But so if you can scale something, so back to our turkey problem. If I could just buy 500 ovens, and maybe I could cook 500 turkeys an hour, or 500 turkeys, every 3 hours. That way, that's one way of scaling. But if I wanted to make that continuous and more economical, I'd have a completely different design of an oven where I've got the turkeys running through, and so there's that way of scaling. So you scale by getting larger and larger, or you scale by just putting more units in. And so solar power has scaled that way, and it's scaled well. It's built. Solar power is pretty cheap power in a lot of places now, where it was very expensive power 10, 15 years ago. But it scales by just putting more modules down instead of getting just bigger and bigger. Now, some of the solar farms are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that helps with economies of scale.
Well, that makes sense in the way of when you're looking at how do you scale. I think when I look at how the energy transition, the technology, which ones are going to be the winners and the losers, and how are they going to scale to keep up with demand, I think it's going to be pretty interesting to see how do they, manage. But changing gears just a little bit and going back to the shale plays and kind of looking at that, I'm curious. It seems as though in the last couple of years, we've seen so much M&A. There's been a lot of acquisitions. And I get a lot of emails from independents, and we have relationships with all the associations, and some of the associations represent the large uh, exploration production companies. And then some of the associations represent the independents, the smaller. The smaller feel very threatened due to what's happening out there. And so what did you learn? What did you see in 2025 as far as the rising cost of capital that's reshaping who survives in the shell? And are we witnessing potentially a permanent shift towards consolidation? And that would mean fewer independents. And I know we're coming up on a break, but I just want to say I do worry about the independents because I don't necessarily know if we want to look at a world where we have maybe four energy exploration and production companies, and that's it. And all of the smaller ones went out of business because they couldn't afford to do business due to the operational cost. And I'm wondering if that is a real problem as we move down the road and into the future. So I'm going to take a quick break, but I want you to talk to us about capital and how is it reshaping the shale revolution. We're yeah, the shale revolution. We're taking a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Robert Rapier, editor and chief of SHALE Magazine, and we are doing a recap on everything energy for 2025. Robert, before the break, I left our listeners and you thinking about the shale revolution and capital and how it's reshaping truly what we're witnessing in shifts towards consolidation. And I expressed my fear of, will independents have a harder time doing business at the cost of how we're seeing capital being deployed? And then that would mean, if that is the case, that we're going to be dealing with the larger exploration companies, which, by the way, I have no problem with that. But when you start lessening how many people you can buy from, you're also lessening the ability for pricing fluctuation or price having stable pricing. The fewer companies, the more they can set the price of what they want. So or I believe that to be true. And I guess I want to ask you, what are we seeing in the industry? Is this a valid concern that operators are talking about the independents, that because of cash deployment, the way it's being deployed in the pricing, it's making it really hard for them to do business in today's world? Did we see that in 2025?
I think that's a never-ending problem. The never-ending problem, and we've seen consolidation in industry, for forever. We've seen companies buy other companies, and so as the shale boom went on, two things were happening. They were drilling out the best plays, so the cost of acquiring new resources was going up, but they're also getting up the learning curve. And so they're learning and understanding how to squeeze more oil out of all these different plays. And so those two things work against each other. In the beginning, the break even cost was probably 80 or $90 a barrel. And, it's since dropped and dropped and dropped. And now it's probably a little bit below where oil is right now. But, as we go forward here, it's probably going to get more expensive to produce simply because the best spots are played out. And that will make it harder for independents, and some of those guys will get bought out. But, keep in mind, there's a 1,000 companies out there producing oil. So it would take, it's not like you've got, a half a dozen independents and then the big guys like ExxonMobil and Chevron. You've got a lot of companies out there producing oil. So some of them will get squeezed, just like they always have, just like they have throughout the history of the oil and gas industry. But I don't see it. I don't see the independents being decimated. I think it's going to happen as it always has happened before. That some of them are going to get squeezed out. It's definitely harder, oil, with WTI below $60, it's definitely harder for them. Oil prices at $80, $90 is very forgiving. Everybody's making money then. But, belts tighten and people start thinking about selling out, when oil prices drop down below $60.
What about natural gas demands? Because, obviously there's been a power demand surge here with AI data center load. The grid reliability has been put under pressure. What does this say about gas on the long-term bridge fuel narrative? Is it strengthening or weakening? Because we know we need natural gas for all of this stuff, and we see it moving up in demand as well as pricing. What do you think's happening to it? Is it strengthening or weakening?
Yeah, we're definitely in a bull market for natural gas. Natural gas demand globally is growing a lot. U.S. LNG exports are growing a lot. We're now the largest LNG exporter in the world. If you had told somebody 20 years ago that in 2025 the U.S. would be the largest LNG exporter, they would have thought you were absolutely insane, because it looked like we might be the world's largest importer of LNG, in 20 years. I remember Matt Simmons who wrote Twilight in the Desert. He wrote in about 2004. He said it is a certainty that we will have a natural gas crisis after 2005, and the only solution is to pray. And then the shale boom came along and upended everything. Cheniere Energy had built this, LNG import facility that they converted into an export facility. It just changed everything.
How about on the global market? Because that's interesting too, as you said, you mentioned it switched, everything switched when the export ban was lifted. On the global market, as we see them shifting away from pipelines and towards flexible cargoes, how is the U.S. LNG shaping the geopolitics now, especially when we look at like Europe and Asia?
Well, that's the biggest one. The biggest one is that we lessen Europe's reliance on Russia, and that has helped them a lot. It's helped them withstand the loss of Russian imports. The U.S. has found a very good customer in Europe. Asia is more dominated by Australia. I mean, the three huge LNG exporters are the United States, Australia, and Qatar. And Qatar and Australia are more involved in Asia, although we do export there. Europe is really that's been a key to geopolitics in the last 5 years, certainly since Russia invaded Ukraine.
I want to stay on that topic. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. When we come back, Robert, I want to talk about policy volatility and what some analysts are saying about late cycle shale. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Editor-in-Chief of SHALE Magazine, Robert Rapier. Robert, we are doing the end of the year show as we look back and see what was happening in the energy sector. We've seen a lot of changes, but a lot of it, as much as we've seen changes, has been just kind of normal. It's actually been somewhat of a quiet year. We haven't seen any real massive disruptions under this administration. However, we've seen a lot of policy changes. So let's talk about policy volatility. Domestic and internationally, it created uncertainty in investment for sure. Which policies this year do you think had the greatest real world effect? And not in the political talking point effects, but more in the energy market.
Yeah, here at the end of the year, I've been giving a lot of thought to what were the top energy stories of this year. And you're right, there's no big, I mean, some years it's obvious. You got a Fukushima. That's a big major story that happened that year. When you had the BP blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, that was a big major story. We don't have a story like that this year. So I'm looking to see, what really were the biggest trends. And one of the biggest ones is, and you talk about policy, and that is exporting more LNG. That has a real global impact on a lot of areas. The U.S. Rising to become the top LNG exporter. The issue is, Russia is a major supplier of natural gas, or they were, to Europe. And so they kind of had a stranglehold on Europe. And that has allowed us, putting LNG into Europe has allowed them to be less reliant on Russia and less beholden to Russian demands. So that's been a really significant one. As far as policy goes, there's been a lot of policy changes in oil and gas, but I keep going back to, it's really more about price than anything else. If prices had stayed exactly the same and demand has stayed exactly the same, then I think the policy, the lightening of some of these regulations would have had a bigger positive impact. But, that doesn't operate in a vacuum. Oil prices go up and down, and that affects what operators are doing more than anything else, more than if they think they can emit a little bit more methane. I mean, the biggest thing is, what's the price of oil going to be?
Yes. Um, Energy transition with this new administration seemed to have just fallen off a cliff, poor thing. So the energy transition narrative once emphasized speed. Now it's emphasizing reliability. Does 2025 mark a turning point towards a more pragmatic look, less ideology, energy policy potentially in the environment? What are your thoughts on energy transition?
I wrote a controversial article a few months ago called "What Energy Transition?" And the reason I wrote that is the statistical review came out in June, and what it showed is that the growth in global energy demand was far, far greater than the growth in renewable energy output. So what does that mean? It means all fossil fuel categories had to grow to meet demand. So when you talk about transition, what are we transitioning from? Are we transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables? That's not happening. Uh, Renewables are helping with overall demand growth, but they're not putting any, they're not idling any fossil fuel capacity. And that's simply because overall demand growth is so much faster than renewable growth. So renewables are a long way still from being able to actually displace fossil fuel consumption, to actually turn that curve down. Our fossil fuel consumption continues to increase. And so that's what I tell people about energy transition. We're not actually transitioning. I think that's the wrong word, because we're not.
Right.
Maybe in the far future, there will come a point where renewables will reach a point where we actually are transitioning and fossil fuels start to decline. But we're not there yet.
Interesting. There is growing talk, Robert, about a tier one exhaustion in the U.S. shale. Are we overestimating how much top tier acreage remains, or is there still room for more upside? What is your opinion?
I think there's a little more upside. I mean, I look at where we were a year ago, and we're fairly ahead of where we were a year ago. And in recent months, there's been a little bit of spurt of growth. It's just slower than it was the year before. If you look the past 3 years, the trend is it is slowing down. So can we set another production record in 2026? Maybe. I'm not sure. We are going to get to a point where production peaks and starts to decline. I mean, we saw that in the United States in 1970, after a period of robust oil production growth for decades. We saw in 1970 a peak and then the beginning of a 35-year decline that looked like it was going to be permanent until the shale revolution unlocked all this shale oil, and suddenly the U.S. reversed direction and climbed, and we became again the number one oil producing country in the world. We're going to turn over here at some point, and is it 2026, or do we have 3 or 4 more years? I'd say we're pretty close. We're pretty close to turning over and starting that decline. I would be very shocked if by 2030 we're not on the downside. We're not, and I think it'll be a slower decline, because there are still plenty of plays out there, and as the decline happens and as global demand, if it continues to grow as it has, price is going to go up, and so some of that tier 2 acreage then may be very profitable as supply and demand tightens up, and that's what we'll probably see. We'll probably see those areas. Nobody's rushing out to drill them right now, but if oil prices go up, they certainly will.
Well, let's talk about refineries, and we may have to go into break on this one, but quietly, they had a huge year, and they don't usually have huge years. Strong margins, limited capacity, additions. Are we in a global refinery shortage that isn't being acknowledged politically, your opinion? And I think we've got about 1 minute for you to answer that.
Yeah. So refining gets out of cycle with oil and gas, and I can explain it after the break why that happens. You'll often see falling oil prices, and you'll see the oil producers getting hurt at the same time refiners are making a lot of money. And I can explain why that is after the break, because I've actually done studies on it.
That is very interesting. So while one is making money, the other one is not, and flip, and the perception is they need each other, right? Peanut
Of
butter and
course.
jelly, but no, one is going to make money, the other one is not. I'd love to hear that. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're welcome. And we're back. And we're back. You're listening to the Energy Mixx Radio Show. My guest today is Robert Rapier, the editor-in-chief of SHALE Magazine. Robert, I asked you a question about refineries, and you said you were going to go into detail after the break. It seems as though they've had a huge year, strong margins, and they've also had limited capacity additions. Talk to us about why this is good for refineries, not so good for oil and gas.
So I've heard people say before, why is it that every time oil prices spike, it seems like the price at the pump immediately goes up? But when the price of oil starts to decline, the price at the pump doesn't decline as quickly. And that's not just your imagination. That's a fact. That's true. And in the refining industry, it's called rockets and feathers. Gas prices go up like a rocket and down like a feather. And there was actually a study done on this. I think it was maybe MIT or somebody did an economic study, and they showed that when prices are going up, consumers become very discriminating. They will drive across town, to save a nickel on gasoline. But when prices are going down, they become much less discriminating. They're just happy that the prices are lower. So they'll go by their local station and they'll see that gas prices are down a nickel, and that's fine with them. They don't check to see if it's down a dime across town. So it's consumer behavior that results in this. Now, what does that mean for refiners? So it means that when oil prices are going up, refiners have much more difficulty in maintaining their margins. So margins will erode as oil prices spike. But the oil companies are making more money then. But on the way down, that's when refiners' margins expand. So when you see falling oil prices, that's usually actually really good for refiners. Even though gasoline prices are going down, they're not going down as quickly as oil prices went down. So you'll see refiners have developed very fat margins. And that happened, in the third quarter. Refiners had a very big quarter. All the major refiners were up double digits, very, very good margins. And that's because the price of oil was on the decline.
Very good. Let's talk about the U.S. power grid. And it is being asked to do the impossible, electrify everything, power AI, integrate renewables, and remain reliable all at the same time. In your opinion, what is the weakest link today? Is it in generation? Is it transmission, storage, market structure? What is the weakest link today, Robert?
Yeah, so there's an engineering joke that goes good, fast, or cheap. Pick two. And that's a similar situation with the grid. And energy planners, they face a similar triangle like the engineering joke. Power's got to be affordable, reliable, and sustainable, but achieving all three at the same time is very challenging. And that's what regulators and producers have got to manage. Right now, they're not managing the affordability part of that very well. In some areas of the country, they are, but not everywhere. We don't have, we're approaching a point where we may not have reliable power everywhere. We may have blackouts. We have blackouts today. You have a fire somewhere and it knocks your power out. So it's not always reliable. So that's what, it's going to become more challenging in the years ahead because it takes time to plan out these projects. And this surge of electricity demand from these AI data centers kind of came out of nowhere. Nobody was forecasting this, or at least the utilities certainly were not forecasting this a decade ago, and so suddenly they've got caught short. Just like oil producers, just like OPEC did in 2005, they got caught short when demand suddenly spiked, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing, the utilities and the regulators all try to plan for an affordable grid, a reliable grid, a sustainable grid, and try to manage those all three at the same time.
Well, this is the end of the year show, Robert, and so I want to pick your brain and tell us if you can pull out your crystal ball and tell us, do we see more of the same in 2026? Is there anything that you see that is very risky coming for 2026 that maybe the industry or the public, well, maybe that the public isn't talking about, and maybe that the industry should be? Is there anything that you see that you've got your eye on for 2026 that we need to be watching out for?
I think the biggest thing is whether oil production starts to decline next year. And I just don't know. I think that's a coin flip, but I thought that a year ago too. I thought it was a coin flip a year ago. So I think if oil production in the U.S. starts to turn over, suddenly OPEC goes, okay, now we're going to be back in the driver's seat. We just need to wait them out. So far, they've tried to wait us out, and oil production just keeps increasing. That would mark a major turning point if oil production actually turns over and starts down. Because I think especially for OPEC, I always try to put myself in the shoes of an OPEC member and say, what do they want? They want to see U.S. shale production start to decline, because when that happens, they will be right back in the driver's seat. And they're playing the long game, and they know, we just sit tight and manage. We will finally be able to sell our oil at $10 or $20 a barrel higher than now, because the U.S. production expansion is over.
And if you could talk just a little further on that, because I want our listeners to understand why we don't want them setting these prices. If we go back in history and we look, when they were the ones setting the prices, there was a lot of instability, a lot of wars, a lot of things that were not good for America. Can you talk to us about why we don't want to have that happen? We want to stay where we are.
Well, the funny thing is, U.S. oil producers benefit from them setting prices right now, as long as they're setting them higher. When it's a big problem is when we're importing oil. They brought the country to its knees in the early 1970s. They embargoed us, and oil prices, quadrupled, and
I
just
remember that. It was very
gas lines.
scary. Yeah, gas lines.
This is what you want to avoid. You don't want to hand your energy security off to countries that, in some cases, don't have your best interests at heart. So it's the case. We talked on the other show about uranium and how we get 95% of our uranium from overseas. Well, if all your nuclear power plants are reliant on uranium and you're getting it all from overseas, your energy security is tied up in somebody else, and that's what you want to avoid. And that's why you don't want OPEC setting prices. Now, it's not as big an issue right now, because the U.S. is exporting oil. So when OPEC is restricting production, driving prices higher, that's actually good for the U.S. oil industry. It's good for the U.S. overall because it brings more money into the country as long as we're exporting oil. What we don't want to see them do is crash the market. And the problem is they're in control of that. They can crash the market. And so we don't like the unpredictability there of what they will do. And certainly, when we're exporting, it cuts both ways. They can hurt us, then by cutting prices. When we're exporting, they can hurt us by cutting prices. When we're importing, they can hurt us by raising prices.
Absolutely. One of the things that I enjoy the most about President Trump is when he says that energy, and he's not the only one, a lot of people say it, but it's the truth. Positive energy here in the United States is a matter of national security, and we need to remember that. Robert, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. And as we wrap up this end of the year edition on the Energy Mixx Show, I want to extend my heartfelt thank you to our guest, Robert Rapier, the editor-in-chief of SHALE Magazine. Robert, you have been immensely helpful to me. I cannot say that enough. You are one of the most respected voices in the energy space. and you bring clarity. You have in-depth analysts when you come and you speak on the show, and your ability to cut through the noise and bring a tremendous amount of value to our listeners. And for that, I thank you. This has been a year of this. Bleh. This has been a whirlwind year for energy, full of innovations, challenges, policy shifts, and global developments that affect every one of us. And today, looking back with Robert, we've been able to separate fact from fiction, highlight the trends that truly matter, and prepare ourselves for what's coming in the next year. To our listeners, I thank you for spending another year with us, learning, questioning, and staying engaged in the conversation that shapes our economy, our environment, and our future. Your support is what keeps these educational segments and the show going. And we are grateful for all the feedback that helps us make the show even better. As we head into the new year, I'd like to continue to bring on, wait, as we head into the new year, we'll continue to bring you guest insights and straight talk analysis that you can rely on from all of us here, including Robert Rapier, the editor and chief of SHALE Magazine, and a host on the Energy Mixx Radio Show. We wish you a happy, we wish you happy holidays and a happy new year. Thank you, Robert, for joining me today on the show.
Thank you, Kym. And I also wish you and all listeners a happy holiday season. I hope you have a good one.